In this talk about the intersection of sexuality and psychology, I want to begin with a quote from Carl Jung, which is that which is unloved regresses and becomes hostile towards that which does not love it. Now, if we're looking at an individual level, we can see and say that that part of us that is shamed, that is denied, that is abandoned and hated. For example, in a chauvinistic abuse cult, there will be certain sensitive sides in every boy that makes that boy vulnerable to being bullied, because bullies always pick on the most feminine and sensitive side in the boy, often in the girl as well. And bullies, of course, also pick on that which is vulnerable to bullying, which is something smaller, something less resilient than themselves. And when there is sustained abuse, bullying, and humiliation in school without an adult presence, the part that is bullied feels helpless and undefended. And this helpless and undefended state can only be tolerated for so long before the transference of consciousness and identity shifts from the one that is helpless, small, and in pain, to the one bullying that which is helpless, small, and in pain. So, what happens when sustained abuse is allowed without the presence of a single adult? And an adult is the one that protects and fights and advocates and teaches for the healthy beauty of innocence, of femininity, of sensitivity, of dignity. An adult is the one who uses their mass, their ability, to protect that which is within their care. That is the definition of an adult. We're not talking about grown-ups here. Grown-ups can be sociopaths, grown-ups can be narcissists, grown-ups can be a wide number of things, most commonly regressed children. But an adult is the one in the position of having mastered self-love, having mastered the championing of each face inside, that when they enter the space and see one part of the psyche being violated, one part of the community being violated, they personally invest in the protection of that which is being shamed and violated. But in a culture where adults are scarce, the helplessness of the victim is only tolerated so much before it migrates to the power of the perpetrator. And in the process, the wound and the infection is internalized. So it starts on the outside with hostility towards something feminine, towards something sensitive, towards something small, towards something vulnerable. In a chauvinistic system, it is the masculine that attacks the feminine when it's in a place that it cannot defend itself. So it starts with the masculine attacking the feminine. For a certain period of time, the individual being abused identifies with the pain and helplessness of the abuse. When there is no adult present, meaning no one interrupts the abuse and advocates for the dignity of the abused, the helplessness becomes intolerable. And the victim ceases to identify primarily with the helplessness of that which is being abused, and switches to identify with hating herself, hating himself, as they are being abused. And now there is a sense of power. I'm not the one helplessly tolerating the hatred and abuse. I am the one abusing myself as much or more than I am abused. And at this point, the infection is internalized. And when you abuse a part of yourself, because the helplessness is too big to face in a psychologically illiterate cult, some part of you regresses. Some part of you becomes younger and de-evolves. And as it is regressed through the hostility of abuse that is unprotected by an adult inside and an adult outside, there is a hostility towards the self and a hostility towards the cult or culture in which the abuse takes place. So we now have someone who identifies with the abuser because it's too painful to identify with the victim. And having identified with the abuser is setting about to find a victim. So first the victim is inside. I hate you. You're terrible. Why can't you stand up for yourself? You wimp. All that stuff that is lacerating the inner feminine terrain. Now, after a while of going numb or of just becoming overloaded with self-hatred as the abuse is directed inside, then there's a malicious envy. Envy is an awareness of a state, of a reality that I want but I don't have access to. There's a malicious envy towards someone who has not yet been violated, has not been abused yet. And the wall that is separating the person who now identifies with the perpetrator, with the person that identifies with the one who was innocent and violated, the wall that separates that is an extraordinary amount of grief, which requires an extraordinary amount of vulnerability, emotional competency, and safety. In a sociopathic environment, that wall of grief, that wall of trust and humility is not there, is not provided. And so one stays in the perpetrator identification. The process of going from the perpetrator back to the victim is a process of tears, a process of grieving the innocence of what was lost, the innocence of what was lost, the pain that was suffered, the betrayal, the trust that was broken. All of this is the lost self, which is never returning. That self doesn't come back. Those years in silent, frozen numbness don't get redistributed. They can only be grieved and learned from and moved on. One cannot enter grief in a sociopathic reptilian environment. It's too painful. And so this fixation with the perpetrator leads to re-perpetrating the wound. And an envy of those who do not have the wound. And this envy of those who do not have the wound leads to a vicious perpetration to reduce the one that is envied to the same helplessness, to the same numbness, to the same powerlessness, to the same pain that is imprisoned within a sociopathic cult that will not release the perpetrator back through the empathic wall of grief, back into the innocence. And if one does return to the identification of the victim, the recipient of the abuse and the innocence, a sociopathic cult will not protect the victim in their terror from the next wave of abuse. And so you have a sociopathic paradigm then, where the victim is never protected and the perpetrator is tolerated as long as they have enough power, money, rank, and so the choice between a perpetrator that is tolerated and a victim that is violated leads those most frightened of the helplessness, most frightened of the violation, most wounded by the betrayal, to seek to become perpetrators, to avoid being the victim, both within and without. Meaning, if I'm walking down the street with a gun threatening people, the odds of someone else walking down the street and choosing me as the victim go down. If I'm bullying half the small kids in the school and there's another bully, the odds are that he's going to choose the other half of the small kids in the school rather than risk conflict with another bully. And so this paradigm of migrates sociopathically from I was the victim to I learned I didn't want to be that and nobody protected me, so now I'm the perpetrator and I get to and I know that that feels better. I feel more powerful, and so it's an avoidance of helplessness, which is one of the most horrifying and debilitating human states. And so even though I'm taking on the sociopathic wound and internalizing it, I'm disconnected from my own helplessness because I've switched my focus and my identity to the perpetrator.